Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Science Behind That podcast. This is a very special episode because this is the Halloween edition. On today's episode, we'll be looking at three gruesome stories from medical history that not only shook the world with their implications, but also changed medicine forever. So, without further ado, everyone, sit back, try to relax, and enjoy our very special Halloween broadcast, The Science Behind That.
Hello everybody, and welcome to tonight's very special episode of The Science Behind That. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and on today's episode we will be talking about three of the most graphic and brutal medical experiments in human history. Yet, they're also the medical experiments that have revolutionized medicine and changed medicine forever. So without further ado, turn off the lights, sit down in your chair, and hold on for this episode of The Science Behind That. Tonight's stories begin in 1916 to 1988 with the story of a young gentleman named Vladimir P. Demikov. He was a Russian experimental surgeon during World War II. Vladimir's techniques have brought in the era of modern heart transplant, modern lung transplantation, and the surgical treatments of coronary artery disease. However, the surgical experiments that gained Vladimir the recognition of the world stage, was his controversial head transplants, where he removed the head of one dog and transplanted it onto the body of another, creating, yes, a two-headed dog. This experiment has led to the modern question of whether or not we can transplant human heads onto cadavers, and of course has led to the proposed head transplant of a young Russian gentleman in 2022. So, first things first, before we talk about how Demikov performed this head transplant, we need to establish some things. In 1930 and in 1940, i.e. in the 1940s, there weren't really any good ways of preserving organs, other than, of course, putting them on ice. Nowadays, we have a lot of different machinery that can do this, and depending on the organ, there are many different ways other than just putting it in ice that we can preserve the organs. For example, for hearts, with heart transplants, we now have devices that we can hook the heart up to and allow the heart to circulate a synthetic blood, keeping the heart alive, as if it was in a patient's body. But in 1946, these technologies didn't exist. Yet, Demikov created one. In fact, he created the world's first external heart. He created a device that was able to circulate blood outside of the human body, much like today's devices that are called ECMO. which are able to oxygenate and circulate blood outside of the body. And so how did Demikov perform this head transplant? Well, first off, I would like to say the original research papers of this procedure I was not able to find. I found abbreviated versions, but I was not able to find the actual papers, and the reason for that is because after Demikov performed several of these experiments, I believe it was 6 in total, the Russian Ministry of Health deemed it unethical, and therefore most of, if not all of, his papers were removed or redacted. However, in the abridged versions, what it said was that Demikov performed these surgeries without any organ preservation mechanisms. And the surgeries were quite long. And so what he did was he took 2 dogs. And one dog, he removed the head. And he did this crudely through the use of an amputation saw. He surgically separated the vertebra, the vasculature, etc. And instead of doing what is proposed to be done in 2022 of preserving the head, he did not preserve the head. He counted on his speed of being able to transplant the head of one dog onto the other dog instead of actually using a preservation technique. Now, a common misconception when people talk about this experiment is that he removed the head of the other dog that he was transplanting the first dog head onto. That's not true. As I said previously, he created a 2-headed dog. And so once he removed that head from his transplant dog, he cut into the vertebral region of the transplant dog, and he split the dog's vertebra. So half would be going to the biological head of that dog, and half would be going to the head of the transplanted dog. And then he took an esophageal graft from the body of the transplanted dog, the headless body of that dog, and grafted onto the esophagus and the trachea of the other dog with the head. And in that way, he created a dog that had 2 heads. Therefore, their spinal cords were fused, their esophaguses were fused, and their pharynxes were fused as well. Or their tracheas were fused as well. So in that sense, that's how he created this 2-headed dog. And the first couple experiments, the dog survived for 6 hours, I believe. However, in his very, very last experiment, the dog survived for a week before it was terminated. And so what happened after this? So despite the other advancements in surgery and transplantation that Demikov had made, it wasn't until this surgery that he gained notoriety. And most famously, after hearing about this surgery, another surgeon, an American by the name of Christian Barnard, he was annoyed by the fact that Russia had beaten the U.S. to transplanting the head of a dog onto another dog. So, what happened? Well, Christian Barnard did the exact same surgery that Demikov did. Once again, it was deemed unethical, but in this instance, the U.S. Department of Health didn't deem it unethical like had happened in Russia with the Russia Department of Health. In fact, it was animal rights activists that said that it was unethical, and as a result, actually nothing really happened. That surgical transplantation that Bernard did, just to copy Demikov's method, it's just basically boiled down to a debate between two different sides of medicine. One side said it was pioneering, and the other side said it was, quote, vulgar. And it is that experiment that has led to the race to perform a successful human head transplant. As I said, that is going to be, or it's supposed to be, performed in China in 2022. But after this experiment, we have done the same thing with monkeys to great success. So, while this experiment was unethical, it could be considered unethical depending on your particular persuasions. It did open the doors for not only questions pertaining to what is the capability of our medical technology, like what can we truly accomplish, but it has also opened the doors to the idea that we are still able to ask questions in medicine that may be considered ludicrous. And even if they may be ludicrous, something good may come out of them, as in this experiment by Demikov and Demikov's hundreds of other transplantation experiments afterwards, giving us the modern age of extremely advanced transplantation and amputation medicine. So that is our first story. I hope you guys enjoyed that first story. Next up, we have our second story. And our second story isn't per se an experiment, but rather a series of experiments and a cultural attitude that led to the revitalization of surgery as a profession and anatomy as a study in the 1700s in England. So we'll take a little break right here. You can pause the podcast right here if you need to grab, another cup of coffee or something, a warm blanket because it's late outside and it's dark. You do that, and I'll be right here. Well, I hope all of you out there are ready to continue with tonight's very special episode. The next story we're going to be talking about is a part of history that personally I really quite enjoy, and that is the 17, 18, and 1900s, because at least in England there was a lot of interesting things going on in the surgery realm. So before we start off, I'd like to say that oftentimes both medical students and people of history will say that anesthesia wasn't invented until around the 18 to 1900s. However, that is both correct and incorrect. Anesthesia was actually first invented in the classical Greek and classical Roman empires. Back then, they would use a mixture of alcohol and opium to sedate a patient before a surgical procedure. However, with the fall of the Roman Empire and the establishment of the rule of the Catholic Church, a lot of those old medical knowledges were hidden from the general public, and that was until 1640 in France, when the teachings of anatomy and surgery became respectable, and much later on in the rest of Europe. And additionally, before we continue in this story, it is also important for me to state that surgeons, for a very long time, were not considered to be proper physicians. In fact, that's in the US, that's where the whole barber comes from. The reason the barber pole is red and white is because in the 1800s, barbers would perform surgical procedures because it was perceived that the surgical procedure was not prestigious enough to be performed by a physician. However, around the 17th and 18th century in England, surgery became a respectable profession of a physician once again. And therefore, the study of anatomy became once again equally as important. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, specifically England, a very common practice was for surgeons, or at the time anatomists, to give public lectures where they would dissect a body, and they would speak about that. And oftentimes, medical students would attend those lectures and learn about human anatomy. And this was really the beginning of the development of the modern age of surgery, because it was at this time that surgery once again became respectable, etc. But today's story is not about the history of surgery. Today's story is about where did the bodies come from that were used for the dissections during this time period. And that, my friends, is a very complex and dark question. You see, bodies during this time period came from three places. The first place was they were the bodies of hanged criminals. The second place were from a group of individuals which we will dive into called body snatchers. And then the fourth place was later on, around the 1800s, or more specifically between 1820 and 1860, the bodies came from poor people who died in workhouses. So let us start at the beginning. Initially, in the 17th century, we observed a cultural shift in Europe and England, which was, one, an increase in public interest in anatomy and surgery, and two, the respectability, once again, of a surgeon as a medical professional. And so as a result of that, the demand for bodies for dissections went through the roof. And in the 17th century in England, the most common source for bodies was from prisons. So when a criminal would be hanged, the body would be transported and sold to physicians, to surgeons, for their dissection practices. And at this time, this is the interesting thing, at this time, there really weren't any laws about where and how bodies could be sourced. So equally around this time, grave robbing became a big thing. Individuals would dig up the graves of freshly buried people, and they would take those bodies and they would sell them to surgeons looking for fresh bodies to dissect. However, an issue came about, which was that surgeons didn't really, let's say, want to dissect a rotten corpse because the anatomy changes. Around 3 hours after an individual dies, the anatomy and pathology and internal chemistry of that body begins to change. And so that impacts what is observed during the dissection. And therefore, very, 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 very few bodies were voluntarily donated for dissection. So most of these bodies were donated without the person's consent and immediately donated upon death. And that brings up the second source of bodies. So we had hanging, and then we get into body snatching. Now, body snatchers came in two types. There was the first type of body snatchers, who were people that, as I said, were grave robbers, would dig up fresh graves and take those fresh bodies and bring them to physicians. But as previously mentioned, physicians wanted fresh bodies to dissect, right? So instead, the fresher the body, the higher pay they would give the person that brought them the body. So what ended up happening was you would have the people who just brought surgeons, as fresh a dead body as they could find. But then you had the other group of body snatchers. And there were two, the most infamous ones. Their names were Burke and Hare. And these body snatchers were infamous because what they would do is they would go around Edinburgh, where they lived, or anywhere, depending on, who or where this group of body snatchers were. But they would go around wherever they were, and they would look for people whom, let's just say, the authorities would not notice if they disappeared, and they would kill them. And after they would kill them, they would bring the fresh body to the surgeons, and they would get a much, much higher pay for the bodies. And this continued for years, and it became a rampant issue. Now, did the surgeons and anatomists know what these people were doing? Absolutely. But did they object? No, because they got fresh bodies to dissect. And so therefore, in 1832, or thereabouts, between 1824 and 1860, a law was passed, which was the Anatomy Act of 1832, and that made body snatching illegal, which is a good thing. Made body snatching illegal. And so what happened after that? Well, then surgeons got their bodies from the government of England, because the government of England dictated under the Anatomy Act of 1832 that all of the individuals, the poor people who are in workhouses, either silk factories or coal plants, those people that died, that act dictated that their bodies not be buried, but instead donated to medicine for dissection. Now, this is really important. And this is dark. This is very dark. But it is important because it was this cultural shift that resulted in the respectability, once again, of surgery as a profession. So if this dark period in history had never happened, who knows where we would be? Barbers may still be performing surgeries. And additionally, it was this cultural attitude, this lust to see dissections, that finally got rid of the idea of the four humors as perpetuated by Hippocrates and Aristotle. So, that was story 2. Now finally we are going to transition into story 3, and this one, I hope you guys really enjoy. This one is a very, very interesting one. So, I will be right back to begin story 3. Hello everybody, and welcome back to our final story for the evening. Our final story is about the invention of the transorbital lobotomy. And so this one is going to be a little different because the modern day applications of this are less direct than the others, mainly because a transorbital lobotomy is an objectively horrible procedure that, in my opinion, never had any real purpose, and most certainly doesn't have any purpose today. However, let us jump right in to the history of the transorbital lobotomy. So, the transorbital lobotomy and the prefrontal lobotomy are two very different things, okay? So, the lobotomy itself originally was invented by a neurosurgeon named Antonio Munazzi, and he called it a leucotomy. Now, what was a leucotomy? Well, a leucotomy was a surgical procedure where the frontal bone of the skull was either removed or holes were drilled into it, and sections of the frontal cortex were surgically removed. Now, Munazzi, the surgeon who created this, advocated that this procedure should only ever be used in the most severe cases. Now, today, we would never use that surgery because it gets down to the fact that, why throw something out that you can repair? And we can repair the brain. We don't need to throw out aspects of the brain. And so, despite the fact, Munazzi actually received a Nobel Prize, and that was very controversial at the time, and it still is controversial. Sorry, I had to take a sip of my pumpkin tea. After this, a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist by the name of Walter Freeman, was a student of Munazzi. He was quite the fan of Munazzi's work. And he had this idea of making the lobotomy, or at that time the leucotomy, a simpler procedure. Now, Walter Freeman was not a surgeon. He was not a neurosurgeon. He was a psychiatrist. Yet he tried. His whole goal was to make a surgical procedure easier and something that, in all honesty, something that he could perform. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you is to how the transorbital lobotomy was invented. Now, the transorbital lobotomy uses a small mallet and a device called an orbitoclast, more commonly called an ice pick. Now, the way this works is the ice pick is positioned right above the eyelid, hence transorbital, because the ice pick goes right through the orbicularis oculi bone, or the transorbital bone of the skull, which is right. It's the top part of the eye socket, basically. And so what Walter Freeman devised is a procedure that at the time he could get away with doing, because it was not technically, and I'm using air quotes here, a surgery. And so what he did was he inserted the orbitoclast right above the eyelid, and using the small mallet pounded it in to the eye socket through the transorbital bone and into the frontal cortex of the brain. Once it entered the frontal cortex of the brain, he would do small swishing motions of the orbitoclast to damage a large circular area of the brain. and then he'd tap in 2 centimeters deeper and do the same thing, and he'd do that 3 times. And so what was the idea here? Was he just a crazed scientist? Which I would argue to some extent he might have been. But what was the idea here? Well, the idea was that if you destroy the frontal cortex, but more specifically the connection between the frontal cortex and the thalamus, you will treat a patient with severe mental illness. This is also including the fact that these procedures, once again, because Walter Freeman wanted to do it all himself and did not want to have an anesthesiologist or a surgeon on staff, he used it in conjunction with electroconvulsive therapy to anesthetize the patients. And, this is a scary thing, ladies and gentlemen. Electroconvulsive therapy is still used today. And even though back then there were a lot of issues with it, especially as used for an anesthetic, yet electroconvulsive therapy is still used today. So, the purpose of this, as I said, was to discover treatments of a non-surgical origin for mental illness. Now, after Walter Freeman in 1946 performed the first transorbital lobotomy and developed the transorbital lobotomy, his idol, the man that he had worked with, which we know as Antonio Monazzi, completely denounced this procedure, saying that it was his goal of the leucotomy to only be used in emergency situations where there was no other option. But Walter Freeman disliked that idea and instead insisted that the transorbital lobotomy could be used to treat everything from depression to social anxiety and to other things which we will not discuss just because of how terrible they were. So this whole transorbital lobotomy gets even more complex when you realize that at the time, between 1946 and 1960, when the procedure was still being performed, certain mental illnesses were not mental illnesses. Certain things that were considered mental illness were not mental illness. And again, I am going to refrain from naming some of those things, but they were not mental illness. And so basically what happened was, between the time frame of 1946 and 1970, there were around 40,000 lobotomies performed in the U.S. Greater than 40,000 lobotomies. And it basically became an excuse to pacify anyone who was different than the norm. Because oftentimes individuals who were just depressed or unhappy, oftentimes women, unfortunately and curiously, were lobotomized just because they did not conform to the norm of what society had established for them. And these lobotomies would result in complete pacification, but at the same time, they could induce a vegetable-like state. They could result in the patient completely forgetting how to eat or use a bathroom or speak or say their name. And in 15% of cases, the patient would die. Now, here in the final minutes of our episode today, here is where we discuss what were the implications of this on modern medicine. Well, number one, the most obvious application was that it resulted in a firmer definition and establishment of medical ethics and what do we consider to be acceptable and what should just never be done. In my humble opinion, Walter Freeman violated the Hippocratic Oath. Because a lot of these surgeries were performed on patients against their will. And even so, even though in 1946 there weren't psychopharmaceutical therapies yet, you have to ask yourself, is being a vegetable for life a better option than having depression? And I think absolutely not. So the first thing that it did was it redefined medical ethics, and it made us look at medicine, and made us in the medical community look at medicine and more closely align our practices with what is stated in the Hippocratic Oath that we swear by. And of course, the other results of this was the development of psychopharmaceuticals, and not just that, but an interest in neuroscience. Psychopharmaceuticals developed towards the ends of the main use of the transorbital lobotomy. And why did they develop? They developed essentially as a counter to the transorbital lobotomy, as something that was a better option than literally sticking an ice pick in your brain to pacify a loved one. Thorazine, if I remember correctly, was the very, very first psychopharmaceutical that came out, and the second Thorazine was developed, and other psychopharmaceuticals, people started moving in mass away from transorbital lobotomies. And in fact, in 1950, Russia banned transorbital lobotomies, stating that it was against ethics, basically. And it wasn't until the late 60s that the U.S. did so. But it was state by state initially. And so the final results of this was that it did increase the public's, I don't want to say understanding of, but it increased the public's interest in neuroscience, because people started to ask the important questions of, well, what is the root cause behind mental illness, and how is that something that we can fix and that we can remedy without shoving an ice pick in somebody's brain. So once more, a quick recap: the transorbital lobotomy ushered in a new age of neuroscience and psychiatry, redefined medical ethics, and of course, provided the climate for the development of psychopharmaceuticals. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the very special Halloween episode of the Science Behind That podcast. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I had a lot of fun making it. And I hope all of you are having a wonderful Halloween. After all, it is my favorite holiday. So, from me to you, I hope you guys have a wonderful Halloween out there. And once again, remember, as always, stand up and question everything. Thank you so much for listening, and happy Halloween.